The rancher went hunting animals, but captured an Apache woman who changed her fate. Forever the sun had barely begun to rise over the distant mountains when Thomas Harper stepped out of his small, wooden cabin. The morning air was crisp and carried the scent of pine and dust, a mixture familiar to anyone who had lived on the edge of the wild for years. Thomas was a rancher, a man shaped by the land and by the animals he cared for. His life had been hard, full of long days in the fields, tending to cattle, mending fences, and moving through landscapes that could be as unforgiving as they were beautiful. Yet he loved the freedom of it, the way the open plains stretched endlessly beneath the sky. Today, however, was different. Today, Thomas was not just tending to his ranch, he was going hunting. Hunting had been part of his life for as long as he could remember. His father had taught him when he was just a boy how to track animals, how to read the signs left on the ground, and how to respect the creatures that roamed the wilderness. Thomas was skilled, precise, and patient. He understood the rhythm of nature, when the deer would move, where the rabbits would hide, and how the coyotes avoided the hunter's paths. Yet, despite his experience, there was a thrill every time he set out on a hunt, a feeling that something unexpected might happen. And today, as he loaded his rifle and slung his bag over his shoulder, he could feel that anticipation stirring deep inside him. The trail ahead was rough, winding through a dense forest where the sunlight struggled to break through the thick canopy of leaves. Thomas moved quietly, his boots barely making a sound on the soft ground. Every branch and stone seemed alive, every rustle of leaves a potential sign of movement. He stopped occasionally, crouching low to study tracks, observing broken twigs and the flattened grass that told stories of animals passing by. The land was rich with life, from the scurrying squirrels to the distant calls of hawks circling above. But he also sensed something else, something human. The marks of people who had walked this land before him were subtle, almost hidden, but Thomas's experience made him notice the faint trails in the dirt, the small fire pits, and the scattered remnants of what might have been temporary shelters. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and studied the tracks carefully. They were fresh, too fresh to ignore. Someone had been here recently, moving with purpose and speed. Thomas knew that venturing into areas where humans roamed was different from hunting animals. Animals could run, hide, or defend themselves, but people could be unpredictable, clever, and dangerous. Still, curiosity mixed with his cautious nature. He had lived alongside the wilderness all his life, and part of him wanted to see what, or who, he might find. Hours passed as he followed the trail, moving deeper into the forest. Birds chirped overhead and the sun climbed higher, sending shafts of light through the branches. Occasionally, he spotted deer grazing in the distance, but he kept moving, more interested in the faint human presence than the game he had originally intended to hunt. The further he went, the more he realized that this place was different from his usual hunting grounds. The land was wild, untouched by the fences and ranches that marked most of his life. Rocks jutted sharply from the ground, and the terrain rose and fell in ways that made every step a challenge. Thomas felt a mixture of exhilaration and tension. He was stepping into a world that was not entirely his own, a space where he had to respect both nature and the people who might live there. It was late morning when he saw her for the first time. She was moving quietly through the trees, her presence almost hidden by the forest. At first, Thomas thought she might be a child, but as he looked closer, he realized she was a young woman, strong and agile with sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if she were avoiding danger, and Thomas understood immediately that she was not someone to be underestimated. Despite his initial shock, he noticed something else, her grace, the way she carried herself, and the sense of purpose in every step. For a moment, Thomas considered turning back. Many men would have, afraid of encountering someone from the Apache tribe, a people known for their resilience and bravery. but Thomas's curiosity and his sense of duty pulled him forward. He was not there to harm without reason. He had a practical mind. He understood the value of knowledge and the importance of being cautious. As he watched her, he thought about the stories he had heard from travelers and settlers. Stories of people surviving in the harsh wilderness, of clever escapes, and of strength in the face of danger. He wondered what her story might be and why she was alone in such a remote area. As he moved closer, Thomas realized that she was wounded. A deep scratch ran across her arm, likely from the thick underbrush or perhaps an accident while moving swiftly through the forest. She was tired, but she did not slow her pace. Thomas's instincts told him that she could fend for herself, but he also felt a growing sense of responsibility. He knew that in this situation, careful observation was essential. He crouched behind a tree, weighing his options, trying to decide the best course of action. The forest was silent except for the sounds of leaves rustling and distant animal calls. Eventually, he decided to make contact. He stepped out slowly, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "I don't want to hurt you," he said in a calm voice, careful to keep his tone steady. The young woman froze, her eyes narrowing, and for a moment neither moved. She was wary, clearly unsure of his intentions. Thomas spoke again, softer this time, explaining that he had come across her by chance and meant no danger. The tension in the air was thick, a silent understanding that trust had to be earned. She did not respond at first, but her eyes studied him closely. Thomas realized that she was strong-willed, intelligent, and cautious. He respected that. He lowered his stance, showing patience, and waited. Slowly she shifted, signaling that she would listen but was not yet convinced. Thomas understood that this was a delicate moment, one that required empathy and attention. He could not force her, could not act recklessly. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Time passed as they watched each other, each assessing the other's intentions. Thomas thought about the journey ahead. If he helped her, if he took responsibility, what dangers they might face together. He considered the terrain, the wildlife, and the possibility of other people nearby. Yet, in that quiet moment, he also felt a strange sense of connection, an understanding that circumstances could change the course of anyone's life. Finally, she spoke, a few words in a language he did not understand. Thomas listened carefully, noticing her tone, her hesitation, and her courage. He realized that communication would be difficult but not impossible. Patience, observation, and respect would guide him. He nodded gently, showing that he was willing to cooperate, willing to take careful steps. As the day wore on, Thomas and the young woman remained cautious, moving slowly through the forest. He kept his distance but stayed within sight, ensuring that she was safe from the dangers that lurked in the wild. He felt a mixture of awe and apprehension. Here was someone who could teach him much, who carried knowledge of the land that he did not yet fully understand. And yet, he also felt the weight of responsibility, knowing that his choices in the coming hours could alter both of their fates. By late afternoon, they had reached a small clearing, and Thomas realized that shelter would soon be necessary. He began to consider how to proceed, balancing his survival instincts with the need to gain trust. He thought about fire, food, and the limited supplies he carried. The young woman observed his careful planning, her eyes sharp, calculating, and aware. Thomas admired her intelligence and resilience, even as he tried to maintain his own composure. As the sun began to sink behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest, Thomas knew that this encounter would change everything. What had started as a routine hunting expedition had transformed into something far more complex, a meeting of two worlds, each shaped by survival, skill, and determination. He could not predict what would happen next, but he felt a quiet certainty that the forest had brought them together for a reason, and that the journey ahead would demand courage, patience, and understanding from both of them. And so, as the first stars appeared in the sky, Thomas prepared for a long night. He gathered kindling, set up a modest camp, and remained vigilant, aware that danger could come from any direction. The young woman, still cautious but attentive, observed him as he worked. There was an unspoken agreement forming between them, a fragile sense of trust that would take time to grow. For Thomas, the hunt had become more than a pursuit of animals. It had become a test of character, patience, and respect. And he knew that the events of this day would mark the beginning of a story far greater than he had ever imagined. The morning sun broke through the trees, painting the forest floor in shades of gold and green. Thomas Harper awoke first, listening to the soft sounds of the wilderness, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a hawk, and the gentle murmur of a nearby stream. He glanced at the young Apache woman, still curled near the edge of the small clearing, her eyes alert even in sleep. Her presence had been unexpected, but it had quickly become undeniable that her skills and resilience were remarkable. Thomas had spent his life reading the land, but she seemed to belong to it in a way he could not fully understand. She moved with a quiet strength, even in rest, as if she carried the forest itself within her. He packed his small camp carefully, making no sudden movements. His mind was already planning the day ahead. He knew that moving through the wilderness was never simple, and having someone with her knowledge could be both a help and a challenge. Yet he could not ignore the reality of the situation. She was injured, alone, and in need of guidance to travel safely. While he was cautious, a part of him also felt responsibility growing heavier on his shoulders. It was a responsibility he had never asked for, but it was one he could not escape. "Good morning," Thomas said softly, careful not to startle her. The young woman's eyes opened slowly, and she studied him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Her dark eyes were sharp, intelligent, and full of unspoken questions. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she rose slowly, testing her injured arm, and adjusted her small pack. Thomas noticed the way she moved, each motion measured and deliberate, a reflection of someone used to surviving on her own. He gestured toward the trail ahead, indicating that he intended to move further into the forest. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze piercing, as if weighing the truth in his actions. Finally, she nodded, not speaking but signaling that she understood. Thomas respected her restraint. Words were often unnecessary. Actions, he had learned, carried far more weight. Together, they began their journey, stepping carefully along the winding path that would lead them through valleys, over rocky hills, and across streams that glinted like silver in the morning light. As they walked, Thomas observed her closely. She was alert, scanning the surroundings with eyes that missed nothing. Her movements were careful yet confident, and he realized that she had grown up learning the language of the land. She could read subtle signs in the trees, the tracks in the dirt, and the shifting sounds of birds. Thomas admired her skill silently, knowing that her knowledge could mean the difference between safety and danger in this wilderness. Yet at the same time he felt a growing unease. Trust had to be earned, and he had only just met her. One wrong move, one careless word, and the delicate balance could collapse. Hours passed as they moved deeper into the forest. The sun climbed higher, turning the air warm and dry. Birds flitted overhead, and small animals scurried among the underbrush, occasionally startling the young woman, who responded with swift, careful movements. Thomas watched her reactions, learning from them, and slowly realized that this was not just a journey of distance, it was a journey of understanding. Each step, each observation carried a lesson. He felt a quiet admiration growing, not just for her strength, but for her intelligence and adaptability. She was a survivor in the truest sense, and Thomas could see that she had learned much about the world in ways he had never imagined. Midday arrived and the sun stood high in the sky. They paused near a small creek to rest and drink. The young woman crouched by the water, cupping it with her hands and drinking carefully. Thomas did the same, keeping a cautious eye on their surroundings. Silence stretched between them, comfortable yet tense, a shared understanding that words were not always necessary. He began to gather some small twigs and dry leaves, preparing a fire to warm the small meal he had brought. She watched him quietly, her head tilted, curious but cautious. Thomas realized that she had been observing him from the start, noting his habits, his mannerisms, and the way he interacted with the environment. He respected her observation and made sure to act naturally, not trying to impress her, but simply being himself. Once their small meal was finished, Thomas carefully cleaned and dressed her injured arm. She had been favoring it, but she had not complained. Her silence was not submission, it was strength. She watched him work, never flinching, and he felt a sense of mutual understanding beginning to form. Helping her was not just an act of kindness. It was a recognition of her humanity, of her resilience, and of the shared experience of survival in the wilderness. Thomas realized that this moment marked the beginning of a subtle shift, a quiet acknowledgement that both of them were learning from one another. As they continued on the trail, Thomas began to notice subtle changes in her behavior. She was cautious, yes, but also curious. She asked questions with gestures and simple words, pointing to plants and animals, sometimes speaking in her language which Thomas could not understand. Yet through tone and gesture, he began to grasp her meaning. She was teaching him without speaking fully, showing him how to move silently, how to read the forest, and how to anticipate the movement of animals and people alike. Thomas was fascinated. Her knowledge was practical, intelligent, and precise. He realized that he was learning far more than he could have imagined. By mid-afternoon, they had reached a small clearing where sunlight poured down onto the forest floor. Thomas decided it was time to set up a more secure resting spot. He gathered branches and leaves, creating a small shelter to shield them from the elements. She assisted him, her movements quick and efficient. Thomas marveled at her skill and silently acknowledged the truth he had known since their first encounter. She was not simply someone in need of help. She was strong, capable, and unafraid of challenges. He began to see her as a partner in survival, not just someone he was responsible for. As the day wore on, Thomas noticed the subtle ways she adapted to his presence. She would pause to observe him, mimic his movements slightly, and respond with quick adjustments to her path. It was clear that she was testing him as much as he was observing her. This mutual awareness created a rhythm between them, a silent communication that needed no words. Thomas realized that their journey was becoming something more than a physical trek. It was a delicate negotiation of trust, understanding, and respect. Each had to learn the boundaries and strengths of the other to survive and move forward safely. Late in the afternoon, Thomas spotted fresh animal tracks nearby. Deer moving swiftly through the forest. He paused and motioned to the young woman to stay low. Her eyes lit up with interest and she crouched beside him, observing carefully. Thomas explained through gestures and simple words what he saw and what it might mean. She nodded, understanding, and together they followed the tracks for a short distance. The exercise was more than hunting. It was a lesson in observation, patience, and cooperation. Thomas began to appreciate the depth of her intelligence, realizing that she was teaching him not only about the forest, but about perception, patience, and strategy. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Thomas suggested they find a safer place to camp for the night. The young woman agreed, leading him through a narrow path that twisted around rocks and under fallen logs. She moved with ease, guiding him toward a sheltered spot near a small stream. Thomas followed silently, grateful for her knowledge and increasingly aware of how much he depended on her guidance. By the time they reached the stream, the light was soft and fading, and the forest took on a quiet, almost sacred stillness. Setting up camp that evening was a cooperative effort. Thomas built a small fire while the young woman gathered water and prepared a modest meal. They ate in silence, comfortable with one another's presence but still careful, still testing the waters of trust. Thomas realized that despite the unusual circumstances of their meeting, he was beginning to feel a connection, one built not on words but on shared experience, mutual respect, and the recognition of each other's strengths. As night fell, Thomas kept watch by the fire. The young woman rested nearby, her posture alert yet calm. He thought about the journey ahead, the dangers, the uncertainties, and the choices they would have to make together. He understood that the initial act that brought them together could have been seen as an imposition or an accident of fate. Yet he also recognized that it had become an opportunity to learn, to teach, and perhaps to form a bond neither of them had expected. The stars appeared overhead, twinkling in the clear night sky. The forest was alive with nocturnal sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of animals, and the whisper of the wind through the trees. Thomas and the young woman sat quietly, each lost in their own thoughts. Though they had not yet exchanged many words, the silence was not uncomfortable. It was a moment of understanding, a recognition that survival, respect, and human connection were intertwined in ways that neither could ignore. By the time they settled down to rest, Thomas felt a sense of calm he had not anticipated. The day had been long, challenging, and full of unexpected lessons, but it had also been a day of discovery. He understood, more clearly than ever, that the young woman was not just someone in need of help. She was someone who could change the way he saw the world, someone whose presence might alter his life in ways he could not yet imagine. And so, under the quiet watch of the forest and the glow of the stars, their journey continued. The hunt that had begun as a simple expedition for animals had transformed into something far greater, a meeting of minds, a test of patience, and the beginning of a bond forged in the wilderness, where trust and understanding were more valuable than any trophy or prize. The next morning, the forest was alive with the sounds of life. Birds sang in the branches, small animals scurried along the undergrowth, and the wind whispered gently through the trees. Thomas Harper stirred first, as he always did, stretching his stiff muscles and listening carefully to the surrounding sounds. The young Apache woman had already been awake, sitting quietly near the edge of the small clearing, her dark eyes scanning the forest. She moved with an alertness that never ceased to amaze him, noticing subtle changes in the terrain, listening to the smallest sounds, and reading the world in ways Thomas had never been able to. He had begun to realize that the journey they were on was no longer just a matter of survival. It was also a lesson in trust, patience, and understanding. Each day spent together brought them closer, yet it also highlighted the differences between them. Thomas was a man of the ranch, used to wide open spaces, cattle, and predictable patterns. She was a woman of the wild, shaped by the forests, mountains, and the ways of her people. Their worlds were different, yet somehow they fit together in this delicate balance of dependence and respect. They set off early, moving carefully through the forest. Thomas carried the small pack with provisions, while she walked beside him, her movements quiet and deliberate. She had begun to communicate more, using gestures and simple words to indicate what lay ahead, pointing to edible plants, warning of unstable ground, and signaling the presence of animal tracks. Thomas found himself learning more from her each day than he had in years on his own. Her knowledge of the land was profound, her awareness unmatched. He realized that this was more than a lesson in survival. It was an opportunity to see the world through someone else's eyes. As they moved, Thomas noticed how the young woman reacted to dangers he had barely considered. A sudden rustle in the bushes made her crouch immediately, her eyes sharp and alert. He followed her lead, understanding that in this environment, caution was not just wise, it was essential. It amazed him how quickly she could assess a situation and respond with precision. He had hunted animals for decades, but tracking another human, especially someone unfamiliar with his ways, required a different kind of awareness, one she seemed to master instinctively. By midday, they had reached a small stream. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth stones. Thomas motioned for her to rest while he filled their canteen. She knelt beside the stream, washing her hands and drinking carefully. Thomas watched her closely, noting the strength and resilience in her posture. She did not complain, did not ask for help, yet he could see the injury on her arm had slowed her movements slightly. He offered a piece of bread, which she accepted with a nod of thanks, still wary but polite. He realized that earning her trust would take time, patience, and respect, and he was willing to give both. The day grew hotter, and the forest thickened as they moved along a narrow path that twisted between rocks and dense undergrowth. Thomas struggled at times, but she always found a way forward, signaling him to step carefully or shift his weight differently. Her gestures were simple, yet precise, and he found himself relying on them more than he had expected. There was an unspoken rhythm developing between them, a silent communication that allowed them to move together with efficiency and caution. Thomas had never felt such a connection during his many hunting trips, and he began to understand that it was not just her skills that mattered, it was the trust they were slowly building. Suddenly, a sharp cry echoed through the trees. Thomas froze, listening carefully. The young woman reacted immediately, crouching low and motioning for him to stay silent. He followed her instinctively, realizing that the sound could indicate danger, a wild animal, another human, or some other threat. They moved cautiously toward a nearby ridge, hidden from view, and observed the clearing below. A small group of deer grazed peacefully, unaware of the observers above. Thomas had seen deer countless times, but her focus was different. She studied the patterns of their movement, the positions of their heads, and the way their ears twitched at sounds. Thomas realized that she was teaching him not just to hunt, but to observe, to think, and to understand the creatures of the forest in a deeper way. As the day wore on, Thomas began to reflect on the journey they were undertaking together. He had set out originally to hunt animals, but this experience had become much more than that. The young woman had challenged his assumptions, forced him to slow down, and made him see the wilderness not as a resource to exploit, but as a world to understand and respect. He admired her courage, her intelligence, and her unwavering sense of awareness. She had survived on her own for reasons he could only begin to understand, and now he was learning from her in ways that went far beyond physical survival. By late afternoon, they reached a small clearing suitable for camping. Thomas began gathering wood for a fire while she found a safe spot to rest. As he worked, he noticed her watching him, her eyes curious and calculating. He realized that she was not only assessing the environment, but also learning about him. She observed how he handled the firewood, how he interacted with the animals nearby, and how he reacted to unexpected sounds. Thomas felt a mixture of admiration and caution. She was clever, and he knew that any mistake could jeopardize the fragile trust between them. As evening approached, Thomas prepared a simple meal, and they ate in silence, each focused on the task at hand. The young woman had begun to use more gestures to communicate, pointing to plants and suggesting safer paths, and Thomas had started to respond with nods and occasional simple words. The process was slow, but effective. Communication did not always require speech. It required patience, attention, and mutual respect. Thomas realized that this lesson was as important as any he could have learned from books or experience. Survival was not just about skill, but about understanding and cooperation. After dinner, Thomas decided to share a small story of his past. He spoke softly, recounting a memory from his childhood on the ranch. She listened quietly, her eyes fixed on him, occasionally tilting her head in understanding. Though she did not respond with words, Thomas sensed her interest, and he realized that sharing his experiences was a way of building trust. In return, she began to show him her own skills, how to find edible plants, how to move silently through difficult terrain, and how to recognize signs in the forest that he had previously overlooked. Their exchange was subtle, yet profound. Each was learning from the other, shaping a bond built on respect, intelligence, and shared experience. As night fell, Thomas kept watch near the fire, reflecting on the day. The young woman had proven herself to be resilient, intelligent, and careful. He realized that she was not merely a companion on this journey. She was a teacher, a guide, and a mirror reflecting his own strengths and weaknesses. The day had begun with a hunt, but it had ended with understanding. He had not expected this, and yet he felt grateful for the unexpected lessons she had provided. The forest settled into quiet, with only the soft sounds of night filling the air. Thomas thought about the path ahead, about the challenges they would face, and about the bond that was slowly forming between them. He knew that the next days would test their patience, skill, and resilience. But he also understood that the young woman had already changed him in subtle ways. He was learning to see the wilderness differently, not as a place to conquer, but as a place to respect and understand. By the time he lay down to rest, Thomas felt a new sense of purpose. He had started this journey with one goal, to hunt animals, but he had discovered something far greater. He had discovered the value of patience, observation, and trust. And most importantly, he had discovered that the young Apache woman, once a stranger, was becoming an integral part of his understanding of the world. Through the quiet night, they remained vigilant, each aware of the other's presence. Their journey had only just begun, but the lessons of the day would stay with them forever. The young woman, despite her wariness, had begun to trust him in small ways, and Thomas had begun to understand the depth of her strength and intelligence. Together, they would face the unknown, and in doing so, they would both be changed in ways they could never have imagined. The following morning, the forest greeted them with a soft light that filtered through the leaves, casting golden patterns on the ground. Thomas Harper rose first, as usual, stretching his tired muscles and listening carefully to the sounds of the wilderness. The young Apache woman was already awake, her dark eyes scanning the surroundings. She had grown more comfortable moving with him, but her caution remained. Thomas noticed how alert she remained, even in routine moments. It was a constant reminder that survival in this world required not only skill, but constant attention and respect. As they prepared to continue their journey, Thomas felt a growing sense of admiration for her. She had endured hardships he could barely imagine, yet she moved with grace and confidence through the forest. Her presence had begun to change the way he thought about the land, about life, and about his own place in the world. He realized that he had been seeing the wilderness as something to master, something to control, while she lived in harmony with it, understanding it deeply and respecting its rhythms. They began moving along a winding path that climbed toward the hills, the terrain becoming rougher and more challenging with every step. Rocks jutted from the ground, roots twisted like snakes across the trail, and the underbrush thickened. Thomas felt the strain on his body but pushed forward, encouraged by the young woman's steady pace. She moved ahead slightly, signaling him when the path was treacherous or when the ground might give way under his weight. It was clear that she had survived in this wilderness for a reason. Every step she took was measured, deliberate, and full of purpose. By mid-morning, they reached a small ridge overlooking a wide valley. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills stretched toward distant mountains, and the river snaked like a silver ribbon through the land below. Thomas paused to take in the scenery, feeling a sense of awe he had rarely experienced. The young woman stood beside him, silent, her eyes scanning the horizon. He realized that she had grown accustomed to noticing details he would have missed: the distant movement of animals, the shadows of hidden paths, and the subtle signs of human presence. Her awareness was remarkable, and Thomas began to understand that he was learning far more from her than he had ever expected. As they descended into the valley, Thomas noticed her focus shift. She was alert to every sound, every movement, and he followed her lead carefully. It was clear that she was teaching him how to move with caution, how to anticipate danger, and how to respect the forest in ways he had never considered. Thomas marveled at her intelligence, her ability to read the world around her, and her resilience in the face of hardship. He realized that she had survived on her own not just because of physical strength, but because of a sharp mind and a deep understanding of the land. Around midday, they came across a small clearing near a stream. Thomas suggested they rest, and she agreed. As they ate, he noticed that her demeanor had changed slightly. She was less guarded, more willing to interact, though still careful and observant. Thomas felt a sense of connection growing between them. The initial tension of their meeting was fading, replaced by a quiet understanding. He realized that she was beginning to trust him, just as he had begun to rely on her knowledge and guidance. After eating, Thomas began to repair a small piece of his gear that had been damaged during their hike. The young woman watched closely, offering suggestions through gestures. She pointed out a way to use a branch more effectively, showed him how to tie a knot more securely, and guided him in ways that surprised him. Thomas realized that she was not only skilled in survival, but also clever, resourceful, and capable of teaching him in subtle ways. He felt a growing respect for her, recognizing that her presence was changing the way he approached challenges. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, they continued their journey through the valley. Thomas noticed that the young woman began to take the lead more often, guiding him along safer paths, pointing out edible plants, and signaling when animals were nearby. Her instructions were subtle, communicated through gestures and brief words, yet they were precise and effective. Thomas found himself learning quickly, his awareness sharpening as he followed her guidance. He began to understand that this journey was no longer just about survival. It was about learning, adapting, and growing through experience. By late afternoon, they reached the edge of a small grove. The trees were dense, providing shelter and shade. Thomas suggested they set up camp for the evening, and she agreed, moving quickly to find a suitable spot. Together, they gathered wood for a fire, arranged a safe sleeping area, and prepared a simple meal. The work was quiet, efficient, and cooperative. Thomas felt a sense of camaraderie growing between them, a shared understanding that they were stronger together than apart. After the meal, Thomas sat by the fire, observing the young woman as she tended to her small collection of herbs and plants. She explained, through gestures and a few words, how certain leaves could be used for healing, while others were important for survival in the wilderness. Thomas listened attentively, fascinated by her knowledge. He realized that her skills were not just practical, but also connected to a deep understanding of the world, a wisdom that had been passed down through generations. He felt a quiet admiration for her resilience, intelligence, and adaptability. As the night fell, Thomas kept watch while she rested. The stars were bright above them, and the forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. He reflected on the journey so far, realizing that the young woman had already changed him in profound ways. She had taught him patience, observation, and respect for the natural world. She had shown him that survival was not just about strength, but about intelligence, adaptability, and understanding. Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude for her presence, recognizing that she had become more than a companion. She was a guide, a teacher, and a friend. The next morning, they continued their journey with renewed energy. Thomas noticed subtle changes in their dynamic. The young woman was more willing to communicate, using gestures and simple words to explain the land, the animals, and the safest routes. Thomas responded with nods, simple phrases, and careful attention. Their interactions were still cautious, but there was a growing sense of trust, respect, and mutual understanding. Thomas realized that this bond was becoming essential, not just for survival, but for the journey itself. As they moved through the forest, they encountered a group of wild deer. The young woman signaled for Thomas to remain still and quiet. Together, they observed the animals, noting their behavior and movement. Thomas realized that he had never truly studied animals in this way before. He had hunted, yes, but he had not understood them as she did, watching, learning, and respecting their place in the ecosystem. He felt a deep appreciation for her wisdom and a growing sense of humility. By midday, they reached a small clearing near a river. The water was clear and inviting, and Thomas suggested they rest and refill their supplies. The young woman agreed, moving gracefully to the riverbank. She cupped her hands, drank, and then signaled him to do the same. Thomas followed, marveling at how connected she was to the environment. Her actions were precise, thoughtful, and deeply aware of the world around her. He realized that he was learning more from her in these simple moments than he had in years of solitary experience in the wilderness. As the day progressed, they encountered a series of challenges: steep hills, fallen trees, and treacherous rocks. The young woman navigated each obstacle with skill and confidence, guiding Thomas through the difficult terrain. He struggled at times, but her presence gave him courage and guidance. He began to trust her judgment completely, relying on her instincts and knowledge. This trust, he realized, was mutual. She depended on his strength, his willingness to follow, and his careful attention. Together, they formed a team, each complementing the other's skills, knowledge, and abilities. By late afternoon, they found a suitable spot to set up camp. Thomas gathered wood for a fire while the young woman searched for safe herbs and plants nearby. They worked quietly, efficiently, and cooperatively. As they sat by the fire, eating a simple meal, Thomas reflected on the transformation that had occurred. What had begun as a tense, uncertain encounter had evolved into a partnership built on trust, respect, and mutual learning. He realized that the young woman had not only changed the way he saw the wilderness, but also the way he saw himself. As night fell, Thomas and the young woman settled near the fire. The forest was calm, the stars bright above, and the sounds of nocturnal life filled the air. Thomas kept watch, aware of their surroundings and attentive to any potential danger. He thought about the journey ahead, the challenges, the unknown paths, and the lessons yet to come. He felt a quiet certainty that this partnership, born from chance, would shape both of their lives in profound ways. In the stillness of the night, Thomas understood something important. Survival was no longer just about navigating the wilderness. It was about understanding, learning, and growing together. The young woman had transformed the journey from a simple hunt into an experience of discovery, connection, and personal growth. He realized that fate had brought them together for a reason, and that the lessons of the forest, the land, and each other would stay with them forever. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting warm light across the forest and valley. Thomas Harper and the young Apache woman had slept well, each attuned to the other's presence, yet feeling safer together than they would have alone. The night had been calm, but the lessons of the forest remained clear in Thomas's mind. Caution, patience, and awareness were always necessary. He stretched his limbs and looked toward her, noticing how she prepared for the day with quiet efficiency, gathering her belongings and checking her pack with careful movements. She had become not only a guide through the wilderness, but a teacher, shaping his understanding of the land, life, and the strength of the human spirit. As they continued their journey that morning, Thomas realized how much he had changed since the day he first set out to hunt. What had begun as a simple pursuit of animals had evolved into a journey of growth, learning, and mutual respect. He watched the young woman move through the forest with skill and confidence, guiding him past obstacles, signaling potential dangers, and quietly teaching him how to see the land in new ways. He could not imagine facing the wilderness without her. Her presence had become essential, and he felt a deep gratitude for her guidance, wisdom, and courage. By midday, they reached a wide meadow, the sunlight bright and the air warm. A gentle breeze carried the scent of grass and wildflowers, and Thomas felt a rare sense of calm wash over him. The young woman paused to observe the area, scanning for signs of animals, hidden dangers, or potential shelter. Thomas followed her lead, noticing how she had taught him to read the land with subtlety and patience. Every detail mattered: the way the grass bent, the movement of small creatures, the shadows of the trees. He realized that she had opened his eyes to a deeper understanding of nature, one that went beyond hunting and survival, to a place of respect, harmony, and connection. As they set up a small resting spot near a clear stream, Thomas noticed that she moved with a purpose he had not seen before. Her actions were confident, deliberate, and precise, reflecting a combination of experience, intelligence, and resilience. She gathered water, checked for safe herbs, and prepared a small meal, all while remaining aware of their surroundings. Thomas realized that her strength extended far beyond physical skill. It was in her mind, her ability to read situations, and her unwavering determination to survive and thrive. He felt a deep admiration for her, understanding that she had endured hardships he could barely imagine, yet she faced each day with courage and focus. During their brief rest, Thomas decided to speak. He told her stories of his life on the ranch, of the challenges he had faced, and the lessons he had learned. She listened quietly, her eyes focused, occasionally offering gestures to show understanding or approval. Though their communication was limited, it was meaningful. Words were not always necessary to convey trust, respect, or connection. Thomas realized that they had built a bond stronger than either had expected, one based on shared experience, understanding, and the recognition of each other's strengths. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, they began moving again. The forest grew denser, the paths less clear, and the terrain more challenging. Thomas relied on her guidance more than ever, following her signals, mimicking her movements, and learning to move with care and awareness. The young woman's confidence was reassuring, yet Thomas also sensed her caution. She had survived alone for so long that trust was not given lightly. He respected this, understanding that any misstep could undo the progress they had made. Their journey was not only through the wilderness, but also through the delicate terrain of trust, respect, and human connection. Suddenly, they heard the faint sound of horses in the distance. Thomas froze, and the young woman signaled him to stay low. They crouched behind a fallen log, observing cautiously. A small group of travelers passed nearby, unaware of their presence. Thomas realized that the young woman's instincts were invaluable. She had taught him to move with patience and precision, to remain aware of the environment, and to anticipate potential dangers. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for her guidance, knowing that without her, he would have been unaware of the risk. Once the travelers were gone, Thomas and the young woman continued along a narrow path leading to a higher ridge. The view from the top was breathtaking. The valley stretched below them, the river winding like a silver thread, and the distant mountains standing tall against the sky. Thomas paused, taking a moment to appreciate the scenery and the journey they had shared. He realized that the hunt he had begun had transformed into something far greater, a journey of learning, connection, and discovery. He understood that the young woman had not only guided him through the forest, but had changed the way he saw the world and himself. As evening approached, they found a sheltered clearing suitable for camping. Thomas began gathering firewood, while the young woman prepared a small area for rest. Their movements were coordinated, each aware of the other's actions, each respecting the other's space and knowledge. They worked in silence, the unspoken communication between them stronger than words could convey. Thomas reflected on how far they had come since their first encounter, how trust had been built through shared experience, and how respect had grown from understanding and patience. During the evening meal, Thomas looked at the young woman and realized something profound. She had transformed not only their journey but his own life. Her presence had taught him humility, patience, and the importance of respecting knowledge and experience beyond his own. She had challenged him, guided him, and inspired him in ways he had never anticipated. He felt a deep gratitude for her courage, intelligence, and resilience. She had changed him in ways that no one else could have. That night, under the clear sky and the watchful eyes of the stars, Thomas and the young woman shared the quiet of the forest. The fire crackled softly, and the sounds of nocturnal life filled the air. Thomas felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He realized that their journey had been about more than survival. It had been about connection, understanding, and the transformation of two lives. The young woman had gone from being a stranger, wary and cautious, to a teacher, a guide, and a friend. Thomas felt that he had been given a rare gift, the opportunity to see the world through her eyes, to learn from her strength, and to grow alongside her. The following morning, they prepared to leave the forest and return toward the ranch. The young woman's guidance remained invaluable, her knowledge of the land ensuring a safe passage. Thomas felt a mixture of anticipation and respect, knowing that their journey was nearing its conclusion, yet understanding that the lessons they had learned together would stay with them forever. He realized that her presence had not only changed his perspective on survival and the wilderness, but had also reshaped the way he viewed relationships, trust, and the power of mutual respect. As they approached the outskirts of the familiar land near his ranch, Thomas could see how much he had grown. The young woman, once captured by circumstance, had become an integral part of his life. She had taught him resilience, patience, and the importance of observing and learning before acting. He realized that she had also taught him humility and the value of listening, not only to the land but to those around him. Their journey together had transformed them both, shaping their future in ways neither could have foreseen. By late afternoon, they arrived near the ranch. Thomas paused at the edge, taking in the sight of his land, his fences, and the animals grazing peacefully. He felt a wave of gratitude for the journey they had shared and for the young woman who had walked beside him. She had faced danger, uncertainty, and fear with courage and intelligence. Thomas understood that her fate, once uncertain and vulnerable, had been transformed, not through force or control, but through respect, trust, and guidance. She had become a part of his life, not as someone he had captured, but as someone who had changed him forever. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, Thomas led the young woman toward his cabin. They walked side by side, their steps careful, measured, and confident. He could see the strength and intelligence in her eyes, and he knew that she had retained her independence, her pride, and her sense of self. Yet she had also become a part of his world, bringing with her knowledge, wisdom, and a new perspective that he had never possessed before. Thomas felt a deep sense of respect and gratitude, understanding that their journey had been a gift, one that had changed the course of both their lives. That evening, as they settled near the cabin, Thomas reflected on the journey they had undertaken. What had begun as a simple hunt had transformed into a profound story of survival, trust, and personal growth. The young woman had changed her fate through courage, intelligence, and resilience, and in doing so, she had also changed his life. He realized that true connection, understanding, and respect could alter the course of anyone's life, turning unexpected encounters into lifelong lessons. As the stars appeared in the sky, Thomas Harper felt a sense of peace and hope. The young woman, once alone and vulnerable, had found safety, respect, and purpose. He had found insight, growth, and a deep appreciation for the strength of the human spirit. Together they had faced the wilderness, learned from one another, and emerged stronger, wiser, and forever changed. Their journey had ended, but the lessons, the respect, and the bond they had formed would remain with them for the rest of their lives, a testament to the power of understanding, courage, and the unforeseen ways that fate could shape destiny.